to give them, I'm not trying to hit the only shows up to. Well,
We could also stay. What do you have to do? Come to us like that?
me? I lost two.
Yeah, I want.
I watched it.
It's okay. Working at Romemu was cut down on your studying Torah time.
Yeah, I'm working on it, yeah.
That's hard. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. This is Manishtana. Manishtana Haboker is at Mikola Karim. But it's different about this morning and all others that women are in the minority for the first time ever in Romemu history. First time both in office politics and in board. It's nice to see the men showing up, even though Passover is about the Nashim Tzadik Kaniot, the women were the holy righteous women. But everybody knows that in America, in liberal synagogues, there's a huge disparity between the attendance of men and women. So it's nice, at least for 5 minutes, to have just 5 minutes. I don't know everybody's, what the gender identities are of people here in the room, but just by an optical, surveillance here. Okay, so.
God for the women, so.
Absolutely. Thank God for the women, otherwise we wouldn't have a synagogue. Precisely.
Like the old days.
Right, just like the bad old days. The bad old days. Okay. So, okay. So right now we're going to start. We have a lot to cover. I have a lot to cover here, and I just want to say, Mirosh, just from the beginning, that in the class, there are a number of reasons given for Shabbat Gadol. One of them, I know how to do it. I'll do it. I know. We don't want to see us. I know. It's upper right. No, so it's not. Oh, yeah. Okay, so one of the reasons given for Shabbat Gadol, there are many reasons given. Whenever you have multiple interpretations of a given phenomena historically, you know that no one really knows what the original reason is. Like, they keep proliferating, possibilities. So the most desirable and the one that speaks the most to my heart is that the year in which we left Egypt, that particular year, the 10th of Nisan and Shabbat coincided. And the 10th of Nisan is the day in which Moses came to the Jewish people and said, take a lamb, take the God of Egypt and bring it close to you, bring it to your home. And that was a gadol, that was a great moment. Gadol here has great references, the ethical and moral courage it took to actually do that, the commandment on the part of the Israelites. Another less, I think, funnier explanation offered over the years is that Shabbat was Hagadol was typically the Shabbat where the rabbi gave the longest sermon of the year, and the Gadol is the reference to that phenomenon. Gadol means great, big, and so in light of that and informed by that, we have a lot to do. There's a lot of sources that I brought, and I'd like to actually try my best to get through all of them. Because they are all interesting to me and hopefully to you, and they inform the conversation. So let's start with the brachot Torah. Karen, thank you so much. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
V'arevna, may these words of Torah be sweet. V'finu Israel, and start with source number 1. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. The meeting is being recorded, and okay. Okay. I need this for a second. So if we look at the first two sources, we can see an immediate tension between source number 1 and source number 2. Source number 1 and source number 2, I wish I could just get rid of this whole thing that keeps popping up, but I don't think Zoom allows it. Okay, maybe. And B'tuv tzadikim, if you look at source number 1, B'tuv tzadikim ta'alot kirya, when the righteous prosper, the city exalts. Uva'avod risha'im rina. When the wicked perish, there is joy, shouts of joy. So Proverbs, and by the way, just parenthetically and importantly, just to recognize that as we go through these sources, the sources themselves internally think that they are commenting on source material that is holy. And so the wrestling match between the sources is not, we don't step outside of the system, right? They didn't have recourse, right? When you have a verse from Proverbs, it's not as strong as a verse from prophets or from the Torah, but it still has inspirational or let's say divine authority that it transcends, let's say, an article in the New York Times. Okay, it's not an opinion piece. It's not Thomas Friedman versus Bret Stephens. It's a verse from Proverbs. So internal to the Jewish conversation of 2,000 years is trying to make room within the current reality for sources that make a demand on us, right? And if they don't make a demand on you, then of course, then like, what's the big deal? It's okay. It says in the Torah, like, okay, I don't care. But internal to these conversations over the next, let's say, 6 pages, is the assumption that each of these texts makes a demand and a claim. And if there are mutually exclusive claims, that can't be. How do you live with mutually exclusive claims from presumably a source of inspiration that should be clear? That's another assumption. God should be clear. You know, we know that that's not the case, but their assumption is God should be clear, and therefore much ink is spilled to try to ameliorate these tensions. Yeah, makes sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's look at this tension. So look at source 2. If we know source 1, right, in Mishlei, we know that when the righteous are prospering, then it's good for the city, and when the wicked perish, we rejoice. Now that last fragment of verse 10 in chapter 11 of Mishlei seems to be contradicted in source 2 in chapter 24, verse 17. You see that? And this will be the most often quoted source in the coming section. So let's look at it. Binfol evecha, al tismach. When your enemy falls, binfol, nafal means to fall. When your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Do not exult. Uvikashlo al yagel evecha. When he trips, do not allow your heart to be, yagel means to rejoice, okay, to be begila, in excitement or happiness. So can you feel the tension between these two verses? Now, one way to ameliorate this, which we're not going to do right now, is actually, one of the ways the rabbis would do this would be to look at the different terms, because we translate it in English in a very sloppy way, right? In the first verse, Rishaim are evil people. And in the second verse, Oivecha are enemies. Presumably, an Oyev is not just someone who's generally like your enemy, but someone who's actually come to war against you. That's when the term is usually used. Oyev means someone who's come to war against you. And so the one way to ameliorate the tension between these two texts would be to say, oh, here, Al-Chabamayas-Kinan is what the way the Gemara would say it. This is talking about a case when you're actually dealing with an enemy, a combatant. It's like a Rasha, somebody who's evil, because evil people presumably, right, can be turned. Right. We can like hold that. We don't have to go there. We're going to just hold that tension, because you'll see that the tension will also express itself in a conversation about a well-known custom whose origins are not very well known at all. Let's look at source number 3 as we begin our journey into this conversation. Source number 3, and those are the staple ones. I also have one here with paper clip. Okay, source number 3. Yeah. During the Passover Seder, when we retell the story of the Exodus, we list the 10 plagues. A popular custom is to remove a drop of wine for each plague we recite. Virtually every modern Haggadah, and I've looked at this, I have like tons of Haggadot, and I looked at all of them, a lot of them, and virtually every one of them explains the custom in exactly the same way. Even Art Scroll, which is the most orthodox of all the Sidurim that you would find, actually outside of the ultra-orthodox, but they always are pulling things from the ultra-orthodox Haggadot. We don't want our cups to be full when we tell about other people's pain. Right? The plagues happened not to us, but to the Egyptians. And our scroll says that the reason for this is because we don't want our cups to be full. Similarly, a different night Haggadah, which is my friend Michel Tzion and Noam Tzion, David Dishon, as each plague is recited, we decrease our own joy, drop by drop, as we recall the enemy's suffering. Now, it's not clear what the source of this is, and many of the Haggadot will quote in the name of the Abar Banel, one of the most famous commentaries in our tradition, Dan Isaac or Dan Yitzchak Abar Banel from the end of the 15th century and the 16th century. And here's the quote. Yeah, I'm with source 4 now. Do you see it? By spilling a drop of wine from Pesach cup for each plague, we acknowledge that our own joy is lessened and incomplete, for our redemption had to come by means of the punishment of other human beings. Even though these are just punishments for evil acts, it still says, and he quotes the proverb that we saw up in source 2, do not rejoice at the fall and the demise of your enemy. Now, this attribution to Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, right, again from the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, right, is the most common attribution of this source. But if you look at Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel's voluminous writings, you will not find it anywhere. Right? Nevertheless, if you look at the end of source 4, this idea does not actually appear in Abarbanel's commentary on Haggadah or any other source. As far as I've been able to trace it, this is an article that I'm going with. The attribution of this idea to Abarbanel first appears in Von Unser Alten Ozer, in Moshe Bunim's Justman's column for the Warsaw newspaper, Adjunt, in an article dated to March 26, 1937. Right? So the first attribution to Abarbanel takes place in 1937. And these were later collected into a series of books, right? And then published in Haggadah in 1938. And from there, it made its way into various collections of material on Passover, and most significantly to the overwhelmingly popular Hebrew Yalkut Tov Haggadah by the very, very popular and famous in the Orthodox world, Rabbi Eliyahu Kitov, who published this in 1961, and many times since it became a very common attribution. But when you look for it, you will not find it. So where does this come from? Right? Even though Eliyahu Kitov, which goes to prove, by the way, that critical scholarship is not a guarantee when you look at many of these places, and so it requires kind of a bit of detective work. Where does this explanation for the removal of the drops of wine from the cup, where does it first arrive on the scene? So if you look in source number 5, we have, before we say where the reason for taking the wine out, let's first describe where the custom to take wine out at all starts. Why are we taking wine out of our cup? Where did that come from? Right? Maybe that'll give us, first let's locate that custom, and then maybe we'll understand how it becomes a custom that is attributed to compassion for, or what's called the reduced joy theory. We have to reduce our own joy. Okay? So let's look at source number 5. This is a very early source from the 12th century and the 13th century. Eliezer of Worms was known as the Rokeach. He wrote a book called Rokeach. He is what's called as a Rishon, what an early authority would be. Those rabbis who lived from around the 10th century until probably the 16th century, give or take, the end of the 15th century. These are known as Rishonim. They are the most authoritative of the rabbinic authorities after the Chazal, the rabbis, right? Which period begins it ends at the end of the 9th century. Okay, source number 5. Okay, in the custom of removing wine is first mentioned in Pesach Drasha in a sermon of Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, known as the Rokeach. After noting that this is a practice he learned from his teachers, he offers symbolic interpretations based on the number 16. Which is the number of times wine is taken out. 3 for the portents in Yoel and Joel, 10 for the plagues, and 3 for the mnemonic for remembering the plagues. Just to go behind that. So if you go into classic Haggadah, when we come to the plagues, they don't just list the plagues. There's actually a rabbinic edition, or there's a conversation about the plagues. So some of the rabbis say that. Right? How many plagues were there? Well, it says in the Torah that the plagues were the Etzba Elohim, they were the finger of God. How many fingers are on the hand of God? 5. So if 10 plagues are one finger, then 5 fingers would be 50 plagues. So one rabbi says there are 50 plagues. And then, right, so there's a conversation in the Haggadah. And one of the things they do is one rabbi bunched all of the 10 plagues into 3 categories. Ditzach, Adash, Ve'achav, right? Dam, Svadei, Akina, it was like 3, right? So there are groupings. And we take out wine for each one of those groupings. So that's 3 on top of the 10. And right before that, there's a verse from from Joel, which says that God brought fire, right? And Aish, right, and Vitimra Rashan, and a pillar of smoke. There are 3, right? There are 3 other plagues that don't seem to have anything to do with the plagues of Egypt. They're just like it's brought in as an example of plagues, but they're not plagues against the Egyptians. They're plagues in general. So there are 16 drops of wine that are removed. So look at the way the Rokeach invites this conversation. The Rokeach says, Yud Vav Pe'amin. Yud Vav is we never say Yud Vav for 16, but he does. It's usually Ted Zayin, right? So Ted Zayin is 15. I'm sorry, it's usually Ted Vav, excuse me. Ted Vav is Ted Zayin is 16, rather. So Ted Zayin, Yud Vav Pe'amin, Matifin Lachutz. 16 times, source 6 on page 2. 16 times they spill out a drop. Matching.
Sorry, Rabbi, sorry for interrupting. Can you scroll the screen to the source, please? I've gotten a few requests.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank
No.
you. Thank you, Caroline. All right. Yudvav pamim matifin lachutz. 16 times we matifin, the word tipa is a drop. We drop outside of the glass or the cup. Keneged charavo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu yudvav panim. This is connected to some mystical notion of a divine sword that had 16 faces or 16 sides. The Yud-Vav Pamim, there are 16 mentions of a plague or Dever B'Yirmiyahu in the book of Jeremiah, which is actually not true. There are 17, but okay. Lomar Lanu, Lo Yazik. To teach us, Lo Yazik Mikan Samchu Avotenu. This custom teaches us that we will not be injured. That we, in other words, this is a kind of magical explanation for a reason. It's not we're not clear if this reason starts with the Rukach, but it sounds like it doesn't. It seems like he's just recording a common practice. It's almost like we're taking out wine in order to say these 16 things don't touch us because we're about to drink the wine. We're about to drink the wine, so we take 16 drops, each one representing a plague and saying, not on us. In fact, if you look at source number 9, look at source number 9 on page 3. I'll turn the page, don't worry. Look at 9 over here. It says the custom is similar to when one hears about sickness or a plague and one spits from one's mouth as if to say, don't hurt us, heaven forbid.
Poo, poo, poo.
Poo, poo, poo. Toy. It's like toy, not toy. And it's a sign that though through these plagues, the Egyptians were diminished. This last one is really amazing because it's so not the reason offered in Haggadot. Wow. Right?
The opposite.
It's the exact opposite. We ourselves, first of all, we're taking out the wine to protect us, as if to say, thank God it's not us. And second of all, what is diminished is not our joy, but what is diminished? Our enemies. The enemies are diminished. And so, just for a moment here, we have like the origin of the practice, but we don't yet have the origin of where it switched from being a protection to where it became, right, an identification with or reduced joy theory. If you look at source 7 above, you'll see that this by the 15th century, it already became codified in the way of the Rokeach. We have no mention here of the reduced joy theory. So look at source 7, the Maharil. I'll scroll up. Look at source 7, everybody. In the Sefer Maharil Minhagim, in the Maharil was Jacob Molin. He was also, this is a halachic Benjamin, Jewish customs and laws, right? These are the customs of the Maharil, a great rabbi of the 15th century. He writes, Shomer b'Haggadah dam v'eish v'timrot ashan. When you say in the Haggadah, blood and fire and a pillar of smoke, which is from the book of Yoel, the book of Joel, Yatif be'etzba'o mikoso l'chutz be'omro kol tevat pamachad. You should take with your finger, doesn't say your little finger, but take with your finger from your cup outside with the saying of every teva, right? Every word saying it once. You do like dam, one drop, eish, one drop, timrot ashan, right? One drop. Yativ yatzva. And also when you say the acronym, Tzach, which is an acronym for Dam Tzvadei Kinim, Adash, right? Arav Dever Shchin, Be'achav, Barad Choshech, right? Arbe Choshech, Makav Bechorot. With each one, you take out, right? Tzachakol, right? Altogether, Yudvav Pa'amim, Neged Yudvav Panim. He quotes, basically quoting the Rokeach that we saw earlier in source 6, right? And he quotes the Rokeach from the Rokeach. And said there are even other reasons for it there. It says also others. He said I saw from others the same what we do now. The 10 plagues. Each word gets one drop. The Amar. He said this is also Shechina Hagar Avya. This is a minhag or a custom of another great rabbi from France. The Nir Allah Tam. And he said that the reason for this seems to be to say, Yatzilenu, God save us and bring them on our enemies. Yaviu al sonenu, daha hakosot lahatzachali Israel. For these cups are for the success of Israel. Wow. So essentially, we have no idea, right, where the custom, we're not yet at where it turns into what is the common understanding of Gadah, but we certainly have sources up until the 16th century that don't mention this at all, and in fact mention exactly the opposite. In fact, this striking, weird custom of putting your finger into the wine that you're about to drink is to remove these drops because they belong not to us. We're not drinking those drops. They belong to the suffering of the enemy. And it's almost a magical expression for God's 16-sided sword to protect us, right? It becomes almost like an amulet moment, right? And this is participating in a much larger phenomenon, which is that and we'll find the source of this soon, but until this moment in Jewish history, the conversation was not about whether whether we should feel the suffering and the pain of other people or our enemies, but the question was, are we even allowed to think about Pesach as a time of great joy because we were saved from our enemies? Let's turn the page. I know that I have to scroll. Let's turn the page. The source number 10. Now, many of you know that in the liturgy for the holidays, there are a number of liturgical moments where we name the holidays that we are celebrating with special names, right? So on Sukkot, we call it the time of our rejoicing, Zman Cherutenu. Right, on Shavuot, we also have a time, it's a time of, right, we receive Torah, right? Zman, we have on Shmini Atzeret, Haggaz, that we have a number of them, and we also have one for Passover. What's the one on Passover? Zman Cherutenu, the time of our Cherutenu. What is Cherut? Our freedom. Now, if you look at source 10, there's a debate that might be lost to us until we saw these sources. In the Minhagim, in another compendium of customs of Avram Klausner in the 14th century, and in Shalom of Austria, who was the teacher of the previously mentioned Maharil, we have a debate. Both of them are represented in source number 10. Sefer HaMinhagim, the Rav Avram Klausner, in his book of Minhagim, it says, there are some who say that on Passover in the Amidah, in the appropriate place in our prayer book, we should say not Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom, but rather Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. Why? Because he says, because they were rejoicing that the Egyptians that were running after them to slaughter them drowned in the sea, and they were no longer fearful or afraid anymore. And then Avram closed their ends with saying, but we don't do this. The Ein Anu Nohagin Kain. It's not clear why he says we don't do it that way, but when these books say those things, they mean to say that's not the way, that's not our custom. It could be because they don't agree with the rationale, they don't agree to change it, they think it's too extreme. It could be a whole host of things. But let me say this, that this Rav Shalom of Austria, in the very next, right, in the same paragraph, a little paragraph break in the English, you see it here, right? He writes, Sefer Ma'aril in the previous source, the Ma'aril, who said that we have the 16, right? He was the previous source about 16, and it's because, right, that we want our enemies to get it, not us. He writes, Rabbeinu, he says, the rabbi of the Ma'aril said, "B'kiddush b'leil shvi'i shel Pesach," on the 7th night of Pesach, when we make a kiddush, he would say, "Zman simchatenu," the low, not like Rabbi Avram of Klausner, who said, "Time of our freedom." Why on the 7th night of Passover? Because the 7th night of Passover is traditionally the night when we were crossing through the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, and that's exactly when our enemies who were chasing us were drowning. And so at that moment, he said, Zman simchatenu. Now that I see that our enemies are drowning, I'm going to say it's a time of rejoicing. But wait a second. How can he say that? Didn't we start off this year looking at the verse from Mishlei, which says, when your enemies are, meet their demise, you're not allowed to be rejoicing? Okay, we'll hold on to that question. But from all of these sources, until the 17th and 18th century, there is no mention, anything related to this moment of taking wine out of the cup that connects us to the reduced joy theory. Not at all. Nothing. Now, the source for this comes out in the 19th and early 20th century Haggadot, right? I'm sorry, in the latter part of you'll see in the latter part of the 19th century, we'll find the first mention of this, and that will lead us to the earliest mention of it. But first, just read with me in source 11, okay? In the late 19th century and early 20th century Haggadot, they offer simpler reasons, the ones that we just saw, popular books of explanations for customs. The removal of the drops of wine from the cup parallels the Egyptians who were lessened with every plague. These two contain no trace of the idea of the incomplete joy due to the suffering of the Egyptians, and in fact seem diametrically opposed to it. We just saw that, right? And so, given, right, where does it come in? So in his introduction to the 1947 commentary to the Haggadah, Daniel Goldschmidt, who was a great scholar of Jewish liturgy, lived from the latter part of the 19th century well into the 20th century. He writes that in recent times, an attempt has been made to explain this custom in a more ethical manner, and give it a meaning that is appropriate for modern sensibilities, as if we are symbolically lessening the joy of the holiday due to the consideration of the downfall of the Egyptians based on the verse, "If your enemy falls, do not exult." So in a note, this Daniel Goldschmidt, in a note to this explanation, he gives two German Orthodox rabbis, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Edward Ezekiel Banath. There's nothing in the writings of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch on this matter. So he quotes Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was the great modern Orthodox rabbi in Germany, and we have nothing anywhere in his writings that would, right, Daniel Goldschmidt quoted him, but it's not there. But this Rabbi Edward Ezekiel Banath is a completely other story. If you look at source 12, we see who he is. He's a fascinating character. He studied in the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. He was ordained by its great illustrious founder, Rabbi Yitzhak Hildesheimer. He served as a rabbi in Poland, and he was later a professor of Talmud at the Lehrensalz for the Wissenschaft der Judentum in Berlin. In other words, he was somebody who was involved in the critical study of Jewish text. And he was succeeded afterwards by those who know who Chanach Albeck was a great scholar of rabbinics. And Banath mentions an incomplete joy explanation. If you turn to source 13, this is, right, we're getting closer, we're almost there. This is mamish, almost as close as we can get before we find its source, right? He mentions it in 1904 in a lecture on Passover on the Seder. He writes like this. This is his writing in source 13. Right? This is E. Baneth. Here, the 10 plagues will be enumerated, and it is a widespread, though not particularly old, although he's wrong about that, it's already from the 11th century. It's a custom to remove a drop of wine from the cup for each plague. Yeah? Are you with me? Yeah. This strange practice was explained to me when I was still a boy, that wine is a symbol of joy. And because each plague caused our tormentors to suffer on our account, the joy over our own liberation is diminished. Whether this explanation may make claim to historical truth may remain unanswered. You see him backtracking here, right? Yeah. He's not sure if he's making it up whole cloth or whether or not, whoever told him when he was a boy was just, being fanciful. But one must recognize the poetic truth in it because it breathes the spirit of Judaism. Wow. Amazing, right? Now, you might say, wait a second. That's okay because he was in Berlin. It's kind of like he was an assimilated Orthodox Jew. He was he was in public, there were a lot of Gentiles around. He couldn't use the original meaning of it, that this should only happen to our enemies, whatever it might be. Not that all Gentiles are enemies, but, he was very aware. Eliyahu of Klatskin, number 14, was the Eloi of Shklov, meaning the genius of Shklov. He was the chief Rav, the Rav Rashi of Lublin for 18 years. He was a contemporary of Bana. And so he fits the classical mold of an unassimilated Jew. And if you saw a picture of him, you'd see like a From Yid, we'd say, with the Bekish of the whole thing. And he was a contemporary, though, of Bana. And he mentions the same explanation in a book called The Contrast Ledugma, is a notebook of examples. This small 24-page booklet of miscellaneous material, and he never completed it. And he has a little section there on the Parshat Va'era, in the story of the redemption of the Israelites in the book of Exodus, in chapter 6, 7. He led in source 15. He says, "V'nei lo nidnagu k'masei hagoyim." Says, let's not act like the goyim, like the Gentiles, who are joyous at the downfall of their enemies when they see vengeance and kill them. Right? And they destroy them and see their corpses. And at the moment when we will mention and tell the story of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, the Holy One, brought the plagues on the Egyptians, right? Tzach, Adash, Achav, the Namanic. And when we mention, the blood and the fire and the pillar of smoke from the book of Yoel, Shahu Haskarat Onesh, which is the mentioning of the punishment. We will pour out and diminish the cups to dripping out drop by drop. So like Baneth, Klatskin is aware that this is not a traditional explanation, which he quotes later in the text. Nevertheless, he doesn't claim to have invented the explanation himself. Haggadot that focus on the rabbis of Jerusalem cite him as this explanation source, but this is because Klatskin moved to Jerusalem in 1928 and brought this explanation with him. Baneth, as you remember, if you look, I'm reading here in source 16, this is kind of like, it can't be that this custom that is Baneth and Klatskin, that they are the source of this interpretation. Why? Because Baneth said he heard it when he was a young boy. And Klatskin and Baneth are about 3 years apart. So if the source started with Baneth, it's not possible. He said it didn't start with me. I heard it when I was a young boy. If it starts with Klatskin, then how did Baneth hear about it? Because they're contemporaries. And how would no, it doesn't work. So there must be an earlier source. And the earlier source and the explanation there is source 17. This is what we know historically is the final source for how the wine custom it becomes so popularized as a reducing of joy. It's from Rabbi Yirmiyahu Lau. People have heard of the Lau family. the very famous rabbinic family. And this is not late. It's also in the middle of the 19th century. In the book Divrei Yirmiyahu, it's a series of drashot, of sermons that were given by Rabbi Yirmiyahu Lau. They were compiled by his grandson, Binyamin Zev Lau. And here's what he writes. Turning the page. Here's what he writes. On the last 2 pages of the book, and this is a common Orthodox practice, in books where teachings of rabbis were compiled, if the publisher left pages that were blank, they would fill them in because they hated blank pages. They thought it was a waste. It was not appropriate to leave in a book of holy words blank pages, and so they fill them in with any ideas that they were, wrestling with, or any chidushim novelate. So in the last page of the book, it says "Shelo lotzi niyar chalak," in order not to have blank pages. This Binyamin Zev Lev, the son of Yirmiyahu Lau, brings the entire incomplete joy explanation in the name of his grandfather. Zekeni HaKadosh, my holy grandfather, Natan Tam Lashevach. He wanted to give a positive explanation, not just nice, a positive explanation. Why do we take out wine from a cup of salvation? Like, why do we take a little bit of wine out of the cup? Because the Jewish people are filled with mercy. And by God saving us, Mitzrayim Egyptians were killed and they drowned, and they are creatures of God. Even though it is a great joy to us that God took us from the hands of the Egyptians who were trying to murder us, and redeemed us. Ulam, however, tsar lanu, we're very distressed by it. Because through it, others were lost. Because in Proverbs it says, for the punishment of the righteous is not good. The righteous don't want punishments, they want healing and redemption. Ve'im Hashem yitvarach hitzil otanu mibli she'avadonu v'maves achirim haya yoser simchas nefesh lanu. That if God could have saved us without the loss of life, it would have been an even greater happiness for us. And through that, he says, right, we take a little bit of our joy out in order to show Yisrael Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, in order to show that the Jewish people are merciful, the children of merciful one. It says we take out a little bit of wine from each for the plagues in order to underscore that we are merciful. Now, wow, our joy is a little bit, we diminish a little bit. Now, it's not clear that is, that reduction of joy is, right, the common understanding of how we should be behaving. You saw earlier sources saying that we're allowed, like, simcha, because the Egyptians are suffering, and we're allowed to feel that. Now, you might think for a moment that this entire, well, first of all, let's just, okay, we came to it. Okay, now we got it. Everybody feel better? Well, now we understand where it came from. It's Rabbi Yirmiyahu Lau, and it's good, right? So now we have a legitimate source for this custom that the Art Scroll Haggadah and others, everybody will quote this one. Clearly, this one landed the most, right? Somehow, like the previous explanations for why we do the custom have lost they're not quoted at all. They're not referenced at all. We don't even know. But it's become so common that nobody even checks on this. Nobody did this academic article until recently. It's like, okay, it sits fine with us. It's kind of like, oh, that seems appropriate. Okay. Now, just to understand for a moment, the reduced joy theory didn't come out of nowhere. The reduced joy theory, as it applies to the reduction of wine, right, is a secondary meaning ascribed to it. Clearly, the people who started the custom did not have this meaning ascribed to it. That's not why they started it, but that's okay. But we have a much larger body of literature on the reduced joy theory, right? There is an entire body of literature that we're going to turn to now that discusses this notion of reducing our joy on the Chag, and that's what we're going to turn to now. We're going to so let's look at those sources. Then I will come in for landing and take questions, things like that. Okay. So look at source 20, verse 20. It's on page 7. In a conversation in the Gemara in Erechim, the rabbis noticed something, which is, it's kind of funny because clearly at the time of the writing of the Babylonian Talmud, there was already a custom to recite Hallel. What is Hallel? Hallel is the liturgical expression of joy on all the holidays, and it basically a set number of poems or psalms are recited. And there is clearly already at the time of source number 20, a difference between Sukkot and Passover. On Sukkot, it seems that we say Hallel all 7 days in the time of the Talmud. Like in the temple, they would get the band together, they would say all of the Psalms. But on Passover, they only did it on the first day. The remaining 6 days on Passover, they didn't say Hallel at all. The rabbis of the Talmud want to go why? Why don't we say all of Hallel on Passover, on every day of Passover? Why don't we say Hallel on every day of Passover? And why on Sukkot we say Hallel every single day of Sukkot, all 7, 8 days? Okay, so here's an answer. Look at source number 20. What is it? What's different about this? Is also Manishtana. Why is it different on Sukkot? We say Hallel every single day, but on Pesach we don't say Hallel every day, but only on the first day. The answer of the Gemara is this: Kol Yom Adechad Chalukin b'Karbonosein. The Pesach ain't Chalukin b'Karbonosein. Like a strange answer. The Gemara answers that on the days of Sukkot, every day of Sukkot had a different series of offerings, sacrificial offerings. Right, the number of bulls offered each day in the book of Numbers, chapter 29. There are different number of bulls offered each day, and so each day was unique. They said the Hallel every single day, but because Passover every single day is the same in the sacrificial rite, they only had to do it on the first day, and then it was that was it. Only right, the first day is the same as all the other days, so we'll do it on the first day. Right, there's no difference. So here the answer for why we do Hallel on Sukkot and not on Passover has nothing to do with the ethical and moral reasoning, but rather why? A technicality having to do with the nature of the sacrificial system, right? Hallel seems to be it's a different day, so we offer a different Hallel on this day because it's a different day. I'm not even it's a very strange answer, but it doesn't take long before the rabbis actually offer a much more, I think, like a different answer, right? Here, look already in source 23, right to Rebbe. The rabbis will actually offer the same answer and then add one. They'll add an answer. This is from the Psikta de Rav Kahana, the much later rabbinic source, but still a rabbinic source. Look at this one. They also notice that there's a difference between Sukkot and Passover, right? In source number in 22, it says the rabbis there are troubled because on Sukkot it says joy 3 times when referencing the holiday, right? But with Pesach, right, we don't even find joy mentioned once in the Torah. Presumably, they're troubled by this because Passover should be a happy holiday. Why isn't Passover in the Bible? God calls Sukkot simcha, simcha, simcha. It's always joy, joy, joy. But then the rabbis are in the 9th century are wait a second. Pesach doesn't have any mention of joy. Why shouldn't we mention joy? So the rabbis offered 2 answers. One is because on Passover, we're being judged on the crops. I'm not going to go into that. But the second answer is really, this is where it gets interesting. The reason why we don't have joy mentioned on Passover is because the Egyptians died on Passover. Thus, you find with the 7 days of Sukkot, I'm in source 22 here, see, after the bolded English. Why isn't it written about Passover joy? Because the Egyptians died on Passover. And thus you find with the 7 days of Sukkot, we read Hallel, but on Pesach, we don't read Hallel except on the first day, right? Because as Shmuel HaKatan says, do not rejoice in the downfall of your enemies. This is the reduced joy theory applied to Hallel early. And it's also the complete transformation of what was in the Gemara earlier, like a technicality. Why don't we have full joy on Passover? Because in the temple, Sukkot, we have special, each day was a different korban, different sacrifice, but on Passover, the first day and the fourth day are exactly the same. So we do Hallel the first day and we're done. And that becomes from a technicality to a meaningful existential reason for us to reduce our joys because of the death of the Egyptians. We don't say Hallel on the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh days of Passover in complete contradistinction to Sukkot, to remind Jews who were coming into the temples. They had temples at that point, probably by the 11th, 10th, 11th centuries. No, we're not saying Hallel today. Why? Not because of the korbanot of the sacrifice. Because why? Because the Egyptians died today. So we don't have Hallel. Sorry, we're not saying Hallel today. We had a little bit of a taste of that in the months after October 7th, not because of the Palestinians, but because of our own sense that we couldn't be rejoicing while our brothers and sisters had just been slaughtered in Israel. So how could we have Simchas Torah this year? We had no Simcha this year on Simchas Torah. It was completely Simchas Torah this year became Tisha B'Av. So we have the inability to liturgically and affectively, right, be in resonance with the day is now halachically proscribing Hallel. So before we took wine out of the cup, we stopped saying Hallel, right? So what do we have in its place now today? Right? Today, halachically, we do what's called a half Hallel. We can't fully do no Hallel. So the rabbi said you'll do a half Hallel. That becomes the dominant halacha, right? Halacha l'maaseh, we actually, right, we do Hallel, but we do it in a reduced way, almost like taking drops out. It's not like we don't have any Hallel in the second, third, fourth, fifth days, but we do it in a reduced way. We also do it in Rosh Chodesh the same way. Okay. But where did they get this source from? Like, where did they get this source? Where did the Psikta de Rav Kahana get this source? That there's something that we're attuned to the suffering of the Egyptians. It could be just like an ethical sensibility that they but there's an exegetical move that even precedes this. And I want to show it to you. And I want to problematize it so that we can end up completely confused by the end of it. Okay. Look at this source number 24. Do not rejoice in your enemy's demise. We have a struggle going on amongst the rabbis. The rabbis say, when they're commenting on the verse in Proverbs, right, do not rejoice in the downfall of your enemies. The rabbis imagine God saying, hey, in my Torah also I was compassionate towards those who are enemies. See, when you see your enemy's donkey, or when you happen upon your enemy's ox, like we have obligations even to our enemies and even to our foes. Amar Elokim Einata told me many. This is unbelievable. God says, you can't be better than me. You can't be more ethical than me, you Jews. Ketzad, what does that mean? The Israelites should have been able to say Hallel all 7 days, just as they read it in the 7 days of Sukkot. But they only read it on the first day. Why? Because the Egyptians were drowning in the sea, and they are my enemies, God says. And I wrote in the Proverbs, kind of interesting because Proverbs is not like Torah, but it's in the Bible. I wrote, don't be happy when your enemies are their demise, right? This is so confusing and amazing, but so we have a source in our tradition that says the entire time that Noach was in the Teva, in the ark, he didn't have sex with his wife. Not because there were animals everywhere and they had no privacy, that might be what you think, but because there's an ethical problem with being in the ark while the entire world is being destroyed. It's also, by the way, came up a lot in COVID when, how do we have joy when the world is falling apart? How can we just go on with our life when the whole world is falling apart? We're the ones that are being saved, but really, is that the way to revel? Like, you can just go on having a meal and celebrating, you have your normal sexual intercourse and your normal, like, happy and laughter? No, the world is going to pieces, and God says, you can't be more ethical and moral than me, so don't have halal the whole, right? So where are they getting this? So look at the next source. The Gemara, this is earlier than the last source, and gets to this exegetical move, and it's problematic, it's interesting. You'll see it in a moment in source 26 too, in the Tanchuma. The Gemara says, Amar Shmuel bar Nachman Amar Rav Yonasan, Mai dichsiv v'lo karav ze el ze kol halayla. It says in chapter 14, verse 20, in the book of Exodus, and this Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says in the name of Rabbi Jonathan, and the two camps, right, didn't come one close to the other, right? V'lo karav. They didn't come close. Karav means close. One to the other. Ze el ze kol halayla, all night long. What is the simple meaning of the text? Is that the entire night, the Egyptians and the Israelites in their two camps did not come into contact with one another. They were protected. There was a buffer, right? Lo karav. They didn't come close. And when you hear, let me just ask all of you rabbis and midrashists, when you hear the phrase ze el ze, does it remind you of any other well-known liturgical, piece that we say, or that call Israel Aredim ze la ze, right? Ze la ze, but here it's ze el ze, right? It's the angels when we say, right? We say ze el ze v'amar, right? It's like, the kara ze el ze, and they call one to the other, right? Right before we say kadosh, 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 we say the kara ze el ze. One calls to the other. So this rabbi hears ze el ze, and he applies the ze el ze of the angels in the book of Isaiah to the ze el ze of the two camps, and says that there's another thing happening at the same time. As these two didn't come close to one another, the angels who usually call ze el ze, they usually kara, call one to the other. They also could not call one to the other because there was a gag order placed on them not to call, right? When the angels call, it's singing, because when they call, it's a song, they sing. So look at what this rabbi says. This is the most famous source for everything we're talking about right now. Everything for the last 45 minutes. Every single source, including the reduced joy theory that relates to the spilling of the wine, is sourced in this rabbinic teaching. Like, we're digging, and we come right. This is the source of this water. This one midrashic move. At that hour, the angels requested to sing a song before God. That's the meaning of kara zel zeh. They called one to the other. But in this verse, below karav, they didn't. Amar, right? Amar lahen HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and God said to them, Maaseh yadai tovim bayam. The work of my hands are drowning in the sea. Ve'atem omrim shira lefanai. The rhetorical rebuke. God says, and you now want to start singing a song as my handiwork is drowning in the sea? That's your response. Now, when God says the work of my hands are drowning in the sea, in this midrash, what is God referring to? Who is God referring to? So prima facie, like, it seems at first, like face value, it seems, if you look at the English translation brought in the name over here on the left side, what does it say? I.e. the Egyptians. So apparently God is not gladdened by the downfall of the wicked. And now you understand all the things that we already learned, which are later than this, make sense in light of this interpretation. But it's not clear to me and to many others who are the handiwork that are drowning. And in fact, what's even more problematic is the simple reading of the Bible seems to indicate that not only is it permissible to sing, right, when the Israelites sang a song, like the very next moment, the Israelites are the ones who are singing a song. So is God rebuking the angels? Let's say assume that who the ones who are drowning are the Egyptians, let's say. Yeah. Who else could it be?
Who else could be drowning at that moment?
Yeah. It could very well be that it's unclear if the Israelites are going to make it through. Let's see. It's not clear, by the way, when it says, right, but below Karav Zelzeh happens before the splitting of the sea. The verse is not talking about what's happening when the sea is already split. It's actually a drasha that takes place in the Bible. It actually is much closer to, like, it's not clear. The hard part here is it says drowning, and the Israelites are not drowning. But the other difficulty is that they want
Tovim could be understood.
Tovim could also mean being like they're
being claimed.
They're being claimed. That's also Tovim means also to
Like
float.
they're collecting their due at that moment.
Right. And so
It's
it's very different. And it happens, the problem with this, with its understanding, of course, is that if you look at the moment chronologically in the text, it's that chapter 14, verse 20 has nothing to do. It's before they enter the sea and God rebukes the angels. So there are a number of problems here. One is that it's before the drowning. Two, it's not clear who Masei Adaya, who are the handiwork. And three, most problematically here is that the Israelites who break out in song, when in fact they see that their enemies have drowned, are not rebuked at all. In fact, we raise up that song each and every day. We say the Shirat Hayam. We say the Shirat Hayam. We say it in the Torah. Like, if singing a song when your enemies fall.
Because humans and angels are different.
Right. So that's the understanding. We'll get there. It pays to go to rabbinical school and then teach for 25 years. Okay, so let's get there.
I'll keep quiet.
Look at source number 26. Look at source number 6. In source 26, it says, Yisrael ayu nesuna b'tzara bayam. And this problematizes the text very much. The Gemara. This is later, source 26 is later than source 25 chronologically. Later. Israel was placed in danger at the sea. Yisrael ayu netunim b'tzara. They were in tzara. They were in a narrow place. Ba'u malachai sharei lekales lakadosh baruch hu. And God came the angels came, the ministering angels, and came to praise God. Nazaf bahan, this is even stronger. God reprimanded them and said, Banai nitunim batzara. You see here a change in the words. It's not my handiwork, which seems to be, is it the Israelites? Is it the Egyptians? It says Banai. Now that could also be referring to the Egyptians, but it's not, right? Like in general, in the Tanchuma, you wouldn't have God referring to the Egyptians, and plus the Egyptians were not in a narrow place at this moment. It's the Israelites who are in a narrow place. This text 26, seems to be, right, either contradicting the generally assumed understanding of 25, of source 25, when the Gemara says, my handiwork, and the understanding is it's the Egyptians, and God is saying, oh, I can't sing because the Egyptians are suffering. 26 says, no, it's not the Egyptians who are suffering, it's the Israelites who are suffering, right? And look at source 27, even stronger. You look at Shemot Rabbah, also a late rabbinic source. It's after the time of the Gemara. It's later than Sanhedrin. Source 27 says, then Moses sang the song, Az Yeshir Moshe. Hadau dichtiv tidnu shirim acher nognim, achar nognim. The singers first and then the musicians. The Rabbi Yochanan said, the angels sought to recite song before the Holy One of Blessing on that night that Israel crossed the sea, but the Holy One of Blessing did not allow them to do so. He said to them, my legions are in distress, legionai, or legionotai. That means the Israelites, right? And you are now coming to sing to me? And this is what is written, one did not approach the other ze'el zeh throughout the night, right? So now this is incorporating the earlier midrash about one to the other didn't come close. One didn't call out to the other one. When Israel emerged from the sea, the angels came to precede Israel with their song before the Holy One, blessed be He. And God said, let my children go first. This is what is written. Then Moses sang, Az Shar is not stated, but rather Az Yashir. God said, let Moses and the children of Israel sing first. This is making it abundantly clear that the conversation between God and the angels is about the children of Israel, about the appropriateness of when the angels should sing their song. The angels are allowed to sing their song, but they should not sing their song when the fate of the Jews is still not clear. And so you have already now, in the earliest place where reducing the joy theory appears. You have those who say that we should reduce Hallel because of the suffering of the Egyptians. And then you have others who say that even before that source, that we should reduce the joy in general because God said to the angels, don't sing song now because the Egyptians are suffering. That's the reduced joy, empathy for those who died when our liberation was taking place. That school of thought. And you have an entirely other school of thought that says, no, the Israelites are allowed to sing. God was not worried about the Egyptian suffering. God understood that the Israelites were in grave, grave danger. And they were permitted to sing, and the angels could sing with them too, but at a later time. And we have these two competing schools of thought. And I want to say that if you look here, I'm just going to finish with two sources. One, a contemporary source, and the second one, also a contemporary source. And then I'll open it up for comments for the last 15 minutes. This is all in Hebrew. It's source 29. It's a question asked to a posek, to a halachic decisor in Israel. Ha'im yesh lismoach al mitat Arafat. Some person came to a rabbi and said, am I allowed to be happy when Yasser Arafat was killed or died? These are the kinds of questions, right? On the one hand, you say that you're laughing, but I think it's amazing. Like amazing to go to a rabbi to ask, like they're wondering how to fit this into their categories. I love it. Then Nachon writes, this is Reb Shlomo Aviner. Nachon shenemar, Zen Nachon shenemar bin folei bechal dismach. He says it's true that it says in Proverbs, when your enemies fall, do not be happy. Aval yesh oivim veyesh oivim. Says, but he says there are enemies, and then there are enemies. The Gemara, he says in the Talmud in Masechet Megillah, in Tractate Megillah 16a, Misupar, it says, Shekasher Mordechai nilkach al asus al yidei Haman. There's a story in the Gemara that Mordechai was placed onto the horse. Of course, it's in the Megillah, but the Gemara recounts a story that went in the moment when he was taken on the horse and led by Haman. Ulona Akbo Rachamim Yiterim. He didn't treat Haman with great compassion. And Haman asked, in the language of the rabbis, the way they created an external, they externalized the dialogue that they were having internally, that Haman turned to Mordechai and said, wait a second, in Proverbs, it says, when your enemy is falling, don't be that happy. So Haman quoted the Torah to Mordechai and said, hey, Mordechai, are you a from Jew? You're supposed to be treating me well. What are you doing? And so Mordechai said to him, Lo midubar alecha. That verse wasn't talking about you. You want to murder the Jewish people. You, Hitler, right? You Sinwar, you Hamas. We're not happy. We're happy that you have a demise. And then he writes like this, and this is really powerful. Gam Arafat Haman kazeh shelo rak ratzah leharod Yehudim. It's not just that Arafat was like Haman. He was like Haman. He wanted to murder Jews. Ele b'fol harag Yehudim rabim. He said, but in actual practice, he killed many Jews. V'shir almanot v'almanim rabim. He created many widows and orphans, and thousands of those who were handicapped and wounded, v'sovlim and suffering. V'yesharim shekol yeled. And there are some who say shekol yeled v'Yisrael yesh lo ptzia nafshit me'adam karov lo shenarag. That there are some who say that every child in Israel has an emotional injury, PTSD, because of losing someone close to them. Right? However, he says that when the angels wanted to sing and join in the song of the children of Israel, you see how everybody's getting this, like they have a different interpretation of what that midrash means, what timing it was. But he says in his mind, Rav Shlomo Aviner says, when the angels wanted to join the song of Israel, that they had already begun to sing, God said, no. Right? That even though what I'm saying, right, we have this place where God said, no, my handiwork are drowning, and now you're singing, right? Shira, Zenachon. He said, that's true. He said, like Rabbi Clarissa said, it's true that the angels were rebuked, but the children of Israel were not rebuked. the children of Israel, that there's nowhere in the source that say the children of Israel were rebuked for singing a song. Of course, the children of Israel were allowed to sing a song and rejoice in the death of their enemies. He says, "V'gam anachnu lo malachim." Says also us, we are not angels. K'moshe kasu b'sefer Eish Kodesh. He quotes one of the most painful and poignant texts, and I was going to bring it, but it's too much already. It's from the Piazetzner Rebbe, who was living in the Warsaw Ghetto, who wrote, "Shenichtav toch kidei Shoah." Ha'im malach. He says, did an angel ever experience what it was ever to receive blows? Ha'im malach ba'am nirtzach. Was a malach ever murdered? Was a malach tataf hashpalot? Was a malach ever degraded and dehumanized and made to feel like a subhuman? Did a malach ever have to contend with people that you worked for in peace and tried to in some way make peace with them, and you were crossing the border and bringing them? Did a malach ever have to deal with a person whose life was saved by the Israeli medical system only to go back and murder women and children and rape them in the most horrific, unimaginable ways? Did an angel ever have to experience that? And so the Malachim didn't ever suffer. So they don't have to sing. But we suffered unbelievably. And therefore, at the splitting of the Red Sea, then Moses and Miriam and all of the women and all of the people came out with drums, and they were singing songs that we should sing because of what took place this past Saturday night, where 300 drones and ballistic missiles and people sitting, in their bomb shelters wondering if they're going to be murdered. We have every right to be happy. We have every right to celebrate that, at least, even as we'll sit at tables without the hostages, who, of course, languishing. We have no idea what it's like to live like that. Of course, we should be happy for our salvation. Absolutely, we should drink a cup. And yet at the same time, we know there are those, right? Rabbi Kolreza spoke about it very powerfully last night. There's a deep, deep strand and thread of empathy in our tradition that demands, or at least that school of thought demands, that we recognize that our liberation and our joy is diminished because it came at the suffering of other people. There is a legitimate school that believes that and enacts that. And so the last source I'm going to teach here is this middle path. It's the last source, source 30. We have to live with this dichotomy. If we're not happy that evil has been punished, then we do not care enough. But if we're not sad at the loss of life, then our humanity is weakened. As I live, says God, I do not wish for the death of the wicked, but for the wicked to repent of their way so that they may live. This is from the book of Ezekiel. We have to live with this dichotomy. If we're not happy that evil has been punished, then we do not care enough. Right, I'm sorry, I don't know why that doubled. Maybe the dramatic image here in the second paragraph, apologies for that, of the sea splitting is the actual metaphor for this dichotomy. The two shores of the sea represent the two sides of the story. And we must pass through the middle, preserving and valuing life, yet not drowning in war and hate. The middle path between justice and mercy is a difficult one to tread, and at any moment we can be washed away. Maybe the dramatic image of the sea splitting is the actual metaphor for this dichotomy. The two shores represent the two sides of the story, and we doubled it again, so everything be doubled. And that, to me, and I'm going to close and invite comments. We'll start obviously a little bit later than usual. I wanted to say that there are those in our community, and I'll be frank with you, I will be one of them. There are those in our community who will take out wine this coming Yontif and not mention the suffering of the Palestinians. There are those in our community who don't lack empathy by this non-gesture. There are those in our community who don't lack love and ethical awareness and moral sensibilities by not giving this meaning. I want to make it abundantly clear that anyone would claim that unless you do the reduced joy theory according to these specific sources, then you are somehow insensitive to the suffering of other people, insensitive and not aware that innocent civilians and non-combatants are being killed, then I think you're wrong. And I invite you to really rethink that position. And I want to say on the other side of it, there are those who will. And they also are not, in my personal opinion, although there are those who disagree with me too on this too, but I'll say my personal opinion. Those people, of course, are not traitorous. They're not treasonous. there is abundant, right, source material for the reduced joy theory based on a more universal or ethical sensibility, and that gesture carries great weight for those people and acts as in a way for them to against the fear that they might be desensitized to the suffering of the other. And although I don't personally believe that the gesture is necessary for that, for me or for others, and I understand when I talked to my Israeli friend Nadav Lev yesterday, and I asked him, do you think people in Israel will be using the rejoice joy theory when they take wine out of their cups? He said, I don't think anybody will be thinking about it. Yeah. Because there's so much suffering and so much, they're in their own experience. It's not on the radar screen for them. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, frankly. I don't think that because of that, they wind up doing greater harm. I don't think that's true at all.
Right.
And I want to this shiur was in order to underscore the legitimacy of these two schools. As long as we see one another and we see and recognize one another in this way, I think that there's some great respect and great the community is in some way informed by that, and that those two realities exist. Just wanted to name that. Okay, so hands shut up. Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna, you know what? Can somebody tell Shimon that we're gonna start at 11? Tell him that we can start at 10:15. Or you can start without me.
I'll tell.
Okay, whatever you want. 15. Start at 10:15.
And we'll start without you.
Okay, all right. We're gonna stay in the room and then we're gonna go to the Zoom. So Nikki, let me just tell you the order. So Nikki, Rob, Paul, okay, and Paul, and then we'll take 4 and then we'll come back and then we'll take the 2 people online and come back. Okay, Nikki, go
I
ahead.
want to know if the rabbis told the Jews in the Allied countries to pray for the Germans during World War II, or the Japanese, or the Italians. They were our enemies, and I personally cannot. I mean, I don't want any innocent person to be killed, of course, but I cannot pray for the Palestinians while they're our enemies. If they repent, you know, or we have some peace and everything, they're forgiven, everything.
I've heard a version and felt a version of what Nikki is saying in my own heart, mind, and in others. I do feel there's a double standard that we apply to ourselves liturgically. We're not praying, and when people say, well, what's wrong with praying for people who are suffering? I say, well, then let's start including everybody. Why just the Palestinians? They can talk about, there's so many lists of people that are suffering in the world. It usually feels to me like this gesture, and this is my personal opinion, that the gesture is a demand, especially in the community